I'm Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you as we continue our hashtag China Challenge Month, a series of events looking at the various levers of Chinese influence in Europe and North America. Information, technology, economic, political, and military. This week, we'll be focusing on China's information operations, looking into a deep dive with our experts from Europe and the United States on the challenges that China's information operations pose, what are their strategies, tactics, and how to best address them. We're extremely grateful to NATO's Public Diplomacy Division for their support of these activities. And now over to our senior fellow, Edward Lucas, who will chair today's discussion.
Hello, and welcome to this CEPA discussion on Chinese information operations. I'm Edward Lucas, and I edit the China Influence Monitor, which is a weekly bulletin on Chinese influence operations produced by CEPA and our colleagues at Coda Story. I'm very pleased to be joined by 4 experts on this subject. We have Cindy Yu, who is the broadcast editor and China reporter at The Spectator, and also hosts the Chinese Whispers podcast. And as soon as you've watched this, please make sure to sign up for that, because it's really well worth listening to. We have Maciej Shimalczyk from the Central European Institute of Asian Studies. I strongly recommend following Maciej on Twitter. And we have Maria Repnikova, who is the assistant professor in global communication at Georgia State University, but is also this year a Wilson Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we have Sarah Cook, who is research director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House, and also responsible for the China Media Bulletin, which is a monthly must read. Welcome, all of you. CEPA does a lot on China. We've recently just produced 2 reports, which I just wanted to give a flag to. One is a look at China's propaganda empire, and another is a compare and contrast on the Russian and Chinese exploitation of the pandemic, and both of those are on the CEPA website. But enough from me. I'm going to ask each of our panelists, first of all, just to give us a quick update on what they're working on the information front, and then we will get into a discussion. So Cindy, let's go to you first. What's on your desk at the moment, and how are you trying to get it off your desk and into print?
Hi, Edward. Thanks for having me. So the thing that I've been working on most recently is China's vaccine diplomacy, and also looking at Russia's, as you briefly mentioned, how they're making the best of the pandemic. For China, obviously, it's a special case. The pandemic started there. So what we're seeing in 2021 is China trying to change that narrative from becoming the source of the pandemic to being the solution of the pandemic. And we're seeing that, a little bit last year with PPE deliveries globally, but this year we're seeing it with vaccine diplomacy as well. We know that China has 2 major vaccine manufacturers, Sinovac and Sinopharm. It's also got a military option, which is CanSino. And so amongst 4 of them, they've got 4 jabs that they are exporting across the world. So it's a pretty impressive arsenal of pharmaceuticals to be having under your belt at a time when developed countries in the West aren't really paying attention to this. So at the moment, I'm looking at, having written a piece about this recently, at the moment, I'm looking at what the Western response is going to be with that. Joe Biden's done lots of interesting things with the Quad nations in the Asia Pacific area, Japan, India, and Australia, to try to create some kind of Asia targeted Quad vaccine partnership. So looking at how that would work, where the different national interests lie within that alliance, and looking at that in the broader sphere of Boris Johnson as well, talking about this Western alliance against China. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Well, we can't wait to read it. Maciej, let's go to you next. Give us the view from Slovakia, which is where you're based, I think. What's on your desk, and how are you trying to get rid of it into print or onto the web?
Yeah, so good afternoon from Bratislava. Here, I'm working actually currently on several issues. One thing that's been of interest for me of lately was how China and 5G narratives play out in Central European media, working on that together with my colleagues from the Map Influence project. Another issue I'm working on right now is also the narratives on Chinese vaccine diplomacy and comparing them to the narratives about the Russian vaccines in Central Europe. As you may know, Slovakia was one of the countries that has accepted the supplies of Sputnik vaccines, while the Chinese vaccine has remained on the sidelines so far. But it can offer interesting insights, I believe, to compare these two narratives, and overall comparing how China and Russia appear in the disinformation sphere here in Central Europe is always an interesting comparison, as there's still this kind of lack of understanding of Chinese presence among many in the security sector in Central Europe, while the Russia as an actor of disinformation and hybrid warfare is an actor that's on the agenda for quite some time. And we see, for example, that many of the proxies that are traditionally used by Russia became recently involved in spreading Chinese propaganda and disinformation as well.
Well, I hope we can get onto that a bit more in the discussion, because I think this the China-Russian relationship and China-Russia friction are really super interesting. Maria, over to you. You have a background in Russian disinformation. You've written about that, but you also know about the Chinese side. What are you working on at the moment?
Hi, Edward. Thank you so much for having me. And I think this is going to be a very fascinating discussion. I'm currently on research leave, so I'm actually working on 2 books, both related to Chinese soft power. So I'm writing about how China envisions, practices its soft power initiatives, from media to elite trainings of officials from developing countries to Confucius Institutes, and the larger kind of performance cultural events and so forth that they carry out, in particular in Africa. So that's been the bulk of my research. And I'm also writing more of a popular book that's on how Chinese soft power works through various mechanisms globally. So that includes stories about COVID diplomacy. It includes stories about various trade fairs, Olympic Games, and all kinds of exercises of kind of the way China presents itself in the public sphere. So I find this to be challenging task because some of the data is not available. There's a lot of kind of scraping to do, and my work is based on extensive field work in Beijing as well as in Ethiopia, and a little bit of comparisons to Russia historically and contemporary as well.
Yes, I did notice on your bio that you have based not only Latvian and Russian and Chinese, but you're also learning Amharic, which is the Ethiopian language. That's, I think, is it what must be very difficult to learn, is it?
Yes, it's incredibly difficult. It's a very beautiful language, and the writing script is actually sort of a relief after studying Chinese, because there's just fewer, signs and letters, so it's a little bit easier. But the grammar is incredibly complex. But it's a beautiful sounding language, and I really enjoyed my time there. So I hope to return with a bit more skills to to be able to understand the humor and the kind of the everyday interactions.
Right. Well, you're probably the only person in the world who knows Latvian and Amharic and Chinese, so that's already a great basis, and we look forward to your books. Sarah, take it from here. What are you up to?
So the bigger project that I'm working on is we're starting a project at Freedom House to do more in-depth country case studies about the way in which Beijing and China CCP actors influence the media and the content dissemination in different countries, as well as different forms of response and resilience. So we're at the very early stages of that project, and I've been working primarily on the research framework and the questions and how we'll get answers to these questions. But it is really interesting, and it's really exciting to be embarking. That project won't be out for at least another year. So we're at the beginning of that. More immediately, for this next issue of the China Media Bulletin, I usually write one analysis piece, and I'm kind of planning to take a look back at some of the recent research related to disinformation influence campaigns on social media, to kind of take stock of what's changed and evolved, particularly over the past year. I think it's really been just about a year since we really started to see more aggressive activity in the space surrounding COVID. And so I think it'll be interesting to kind of see how this has evolved on the Chinese side. There was one big Graphica report that came out last month that was indicating that these efforts are not only continuing, but they seem to be getting a little bit more traction, at least among real users, as opposed to mostly within their own kind of bot networks and influence networks. So I think that's pretty potentially significant, at least in terms of the indication that the Chinese side and the various actors involved in this are getting better at what they're trying to achieve in that space.
Well, let's stick with that for now, because that's this question of the evolution of China's information operations is really interesting. And I think that generally we have a problem in the West that we tend to look at these operations historically. So we look back and try and understand what it was that the adversaries were doing to us. So we're not nearly as good at looking at the way in which they're evolving and what's coming towards us. And that's both in terms of sort of the sophistication of the content, the targeting, the propagation, the combination of information with other influence operations. So I'll come back to you first, Sarah, and then go around the rest of the panel to ask, what do you think is the most interesting or potentially troubling evolution that you see in China's sort of information arsenal? What bothers you most, Sarah?
Well, I think what we're seeing more and more is actually this intersection between the broader political influence and how it translates into media influence, where you have local officials and sometimes really high-level leaders in particular countries that have their own reasons for echoing particular points or pushing particular points. And that honestly just gets a lot more play in the local media than whatever CGTN might be saying, or even what some of these bot networks are saying. I think that's one side. I think the other thing is the coercive element. Another report Freedom House put out last month, where China was just one case study of many, was about transnational repression and the real use of like various forms of physical attacks, renditions, other forms of intimidation and espionage against exiles and members of the diaspora. And actually in that, and what's really interesting to me as a China person is kind of seeing how China compares, because there's a lot of this going on. And really out of 31 countries and authoritarian countries that were engaging in this type of behavior, the campaign from China was by far the largest. I have something like 600 cases that my colleagues documented since 2014 of transnational oppression globally. More than 200 of them originated in China. And the span of targets, whether it was, activists and dissidents, or members of ethnic and religious minorities, not just Uyghurs, but Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, Inner Mongolians increasingly, an expansion to Hong Kongers. It is really quite dramatic, and it's a very real presence in the lives of millions of people, particularly people who have left China or have family, of Chinese origins, even if they're citizens of other countries. So I think that's a really very much the sharp edge of kind of the sharp power element. So I think that's definitely something that is both gaining momentum, is increasing, and I think is very troubling.
That's really interesting. So I know we've seen a bit, was it called Operation Fox Hunt, the idea of going after, but that was very much targeted on what the Chinese regarded as economic criminals. It was sort of,
yes, and actually we looked at Fox Hunt a little bit in terms of, I think with Fox Hunt, well, one, you have things like Interpol notices and the abuse of Interpol notices, which again, the Chinese government is not the only government that does this. And in fact, not the worst offender, I think, relative to some other countries from Eastern Europe or Central Asia that engage in that. But yes, definitely this element of also trying to use local legal systems and other forms of intimidation to try to get these types of targets to return, quote, voluntarily. But I think the voluntarily definitely belongs in quote.
And it's so interesting comparing that with Russia, because Russia tends to target Russian diaspora members really only when it comes to intelligence, that they will try and get them to join another country's government or work on them for that. But the idea of, I don't think I've seen any examples of Russia coercing Russian diaspora members back to Russia, really. At least I can't think of any. But Maria, what are you noticing that's most troubling? Or if you just want to respond to what Sarah says, I'll do that too.
Sure. I mean, I want to echo the point about kind of what I describe as delegation of propaganda persuasion. In my research, that a lot of the stories are now told by other voices than Chinese. So it's about hiring local talent, but also about engaging more Western foreign experts to actually tell the story. And I wrote a piece about this in the New York Times last April when kind of the propaganda campaign was just sort of taking off. And I noted that a lot of these stories are being told through the eyes of experts at WHO and other scientists who are basically praising China's response. So it came off as, I think, much more effective through those channels as opposed to through Chinese media itself. And that's something that I think Chinese officials and media are deliberately practicing. It's not a random kind of act of luck that somebody's speaking, from the West or an African official who is representing China-Africa relations. This is something that's happening very much deliberately, I think, on both sides, but especially from Chinese perspective, that try to engage more and more expert voices into their reporting. And many journalists working for Chinese media are not Chinese. They're increasingly international talent and very high caliber talent. I think that's something we often forget, which just sounds like, oh, there's a propaganda operations. Well, they're also paying well. There's stable jobs in journalism. And as you know, Edward, journalism is not an easy sort of sphere now to make money. And so having a stable job is something that's very significant. So there are multiple kind of dimensions of how this works. There are material kind of, job opportunities. There are also opportunities to speak and to tell your own story through international channels, Chinese media. And that seems to be much more favorable for China's story than just telling a story again through Chinese kind of lens. So that's, I think, is very powerful. As far as diaspora comment is concerned, I think it is a very striking comparison, not just in terms of coercion, because that's one side of the story, but also cooptation. Chinese officials have been co-opting or kind of trying to attract or entice Chinese diaspora, right, to come back home for decades now, including students, experts, scientists. They've been very effective at getting people to actually aspire to returning home, right? Whereas the Russian officials, Russian government has been much weaker on that count. I mean, as someone who is, I guess, somewhat of a Russian immigrant, I was born in Latvia, but consider myself ethnically Russian. I never heard of any kind of efforts or programs that would say, hey, come back to Russia. In fact, coming back to Russia is always extremely complicated. Multiple visa processes, very painful and difficult, and you don't feel very welcome going back there. So it's a very different story. So I think we have to take into account the kind of not necessarily the positive, but more the co-optive or persuasive aspect of that as well when we compare China and Russia in terms of diaspora communication.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on this diaspora thing. I think there's a sort of assumption in Russian government circles that if you are Russian living outside Russia, that's sort of an inherently treasonous act. Why did you leave the motherland rather than, and if you come back, you absolutely, it is suspicious, quite possibly a Western spy, and we're certainly not going to make things easy for you. And but we'll get onto more Russia-China contrasts and comparisons later on, I think. Mate, what do you see in terms of evolution that most surprises or troubles you?
So first thing to note, especially about the Chinese disinformation operations in Central Europe, is how fastly they are evolving. If you look on the environment, some 4 or 5 years ago, you would see that China was marginally present in the media sphere here in the region, whereas since 2019, we see that they really stepped on the gas and are moving quite fast in spreading the new operations on how to influence the narratives here in the region. 2 events actually stand out, which I think motivated the change in the approach from the Chinese embassies here in the region. First, in 2019, we've seen surge of influence operations in light of the Hong Kong protests. Secondly, we've seen that in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. Of course, there are quite a few differences between these 2 time periods as well, and which is quite interesting to know. I think if you look on the propaganda that was surrounding the Hong Kong protests, you could see that there was really a coordinated narrative across both of the countries in the region, where the various embassies and proxies linked to them were presenting the Hong Kong protests as a color revolution fueled by domestic terrorists and funded from abroad. And this is different now with the COVID-19 pandemic, when we increasingly see that the Chinese are deploying several narratives at the same time, which may be even conflicting to some extent. So it was interesting to know the narratives about the origin of the coronavirus, for example, when you could see in a short time span different narratives on, for example, the theory of the US origin of the virus and then Italian origin of the virus. There was even a theory about the Czech origin of the virus, and so forth. Which is really noticeable. I think that they are learning maybe from the Russians, because this kind of the issue of conflicting narratives was traditionally present in the Russian disinformation in the CEE region. Another thing to note is also that the Chinese are really moving in a direction of using increasingly more channels through which they spread disinformation and propaganda. So 3 to 4 years ago, you would find these kind of, let's say, influence attempts, usually only like various fringe media which are not widely read. They are really inherently tied to the disinformation scene within the countries. And then in the during the Hong Kong protests, we've seen that they are trying to move in the direction of influencing the mainstream media, which was mostly unsuccessful with a few exceptions. And I think this exception is really worth highlighting. This was the case of planting the narrative about these terrorist groups in Hong Kong in a mainstream magazine in Slovakia. It was an economy focused magazine, Trend, and we've seen then that for a few weeks the Chinese embassy was trying to push a press release into various mainstream media. All of them refused to print it because it was obviously full of disinformation. And when they saw that it was not possible to do it this way, they turned into they devised a strategy to plan to print the story not in the regular section of the magazine, but instead by ad space, where they would print an editorial including this this story about how China perceives the Hong Kong protests. It was interesting actually to note how this story evolved in time, because the Chinese embassy really scanned the whole article, put it on their website, saying that the signed article by the ambassador appeared in a mainstream magazine in Slovakia. Interestingly, the scan of the article did not include the mandatory label that this is PR content, so that was clearly cut out.
Yes.
And from there, it was taken over by Chinese media, which were spreading the story that a mainstream publication in Slovakia is supporting Chinese perception of what's going on in Hong Kong, which leads to the question of what are these Chinese operations actually targeting, and who's actually the audience, whether it's the domestic audience in the target countries, so the Slovaks, the Czechs, and so forth, or whether it's used to influence the Chinese population, be it the Chinese population back in mainland China or the Chinese diaspora living abroad. And you see that it's probably a mix of those.
Yeah.
And in the case of Hong Kong, it was clearly targeted mostly at the diaspora and the mainland Chinese population, rather at the population here in Central Europe. Actually, besides this issue with Trend, it was actually quite nice to see that many of the media showed a lot of internal resilience when they refused to print this, which was something good to see. And then a year later, when the COVID-19 yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say that there's an interesting parallel example, which is the Frankfurter Allgemeine, which is Germany's sort of best known paper, published a full page story on the Chinese anti-poverty program on March the 4th, which was formatted exactly like a regular piece of journalism, with one very small thing in the top right hand corner saying Anzeige, which means advertisement, and it'd be fascinating to know whether that was reprinted elsewhere as a picture of that page without the advert. And the authors seem to be all Xinhua journalists based in Germany. So there's a lot to dig into about this sort of overlap. Why are they doing advertorial, and who the target is. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Matthew. We'll come back to you in a moment, but I want to come to Cindy. What do you see as the most interesting evolution in Chinese tactics at the moment?
Well, actually, I was going to say that split in audiences is what concerns me. And Edward, you mentioned wolf warriors before we started, and what we're seeing with the wolf warriors is obviously much more belligerent rhetoric happening much more on Western forums like Twitter, mainstream Western newspapers, that sort of thing. But that's not particularly, the tone of it is not what particularly concerns me. It's actually digging underneath that to ask why that belligerence is now here. And you speak to other Chinese experts who say that actually a lot of it comes down to serving that domestic audience, which is becoming, especially after the pandemic, more supportive of the party because what they see is an effective public health measure, which means that they are also becoming more nationalistic when they see criticism of China abroad. And one illustration of this is recently on Radio 4's Today programme in the UK on BBC, a Chinese diplomat was invited to have an interview, and on air he called the BBC the British Bias Corporation. And that, to a British listener would have really, really bristled them. But going on to Chinese internet afterwards, I found that actually that was something that netizens were really praising him for, saying that, you know, he really stuck it to them. And that, you know, that parallel interpretation I find quite concerning, because it means that if these diplomats are not talking as diplomats should to other countries to oil those relationships, if they're serving domestic audiences in sort of almost clickbaity way, then where does that leave Western Chinese relations in the future? That's what concerns me a lot, because I think, you know, diplomats are meant to be there to create that conversation, not to make it more difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting, this, isn't it? I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's a performative element to this wolf warrior diplomacy, and it reminds me very much of the Cultural Revolution, when the Chinese diplomats were told to go out and riot in the streets in order that, in support of the of Chairman Mao, in order that these pictures can then be shown, you know, to show your loyalty back in Beijing. There were extraordinary scenes of the Chinese diplomats in the embassy in London, hurling themselves on the police and trying to provoke a punch-up in order that they could then say, "Look how hard we're fighting for the, you know, fighting for Marxist-Leninism." And in a way, if they do that, it undercuts the effectiveness. It means that they look stupid and nasty in Western eyes, and so that, in a way, might be a good thing. If they're, I mean, obviously it's not good for the functioning of diplomacy, but it undercuts the effectiveness of their propaganda if it's really being done for a domestic audience. Sarah, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. And I think it's the same with some of these types of, you know, disinformation in tactics once they're exposed. I think in the China case, it's a little different than Russia, because Russia, in a lot of ways, as far as I understand, though not being a Russia expert, is not really that concerned with international perceptions of it. It's really more about, a lot of times, kind of sowing discord and undermining the other side. But, you know, for the Chinese Communist Party, a big, you know, goal of its foreign propaganda is still to be perceived as kind of a benign win-win. And so when then you have, whether it's diplomats engaging in this kind of behavior or exposure of like these clearly manipulative disinformation type of campaigns, it really being exposed, it really actually undercuts that messaging. And I'm not sure that they've yet figured out precisely how to reconcile the two. And I think there's also a distinction sometimes between kind of the response and the perceptions, you know, from public opinion in the global north as opposed to the global south. Although I think one of the things we've seen during COVID is that actually the reputation of China and the Chinese government has also taken a bit of a hit between both COVID and honestly what's happening in Xinjiang, depending on the different countries. If you look at public opinion polls, countries like Indonesia, countries like Tunisia, that still have pretty largely favorable views of China, but not nearly as favorable percentage-wise. You know, it's dropped 10, 15 percentage points compared to when I first started looking at some of this, say, 2-3 years ago.
Right. So it's interesting. It's like the paradox of the 4 Ws. You've got the win-win approach and the wolf warrior approach, and they don't really fit together. But we've got about 10, 15 minutes left, and I want to just turn now to countermeasures. We've had a lot of analysis of the problem and how it's evolving, and I'd like each of you just to give me, if you could give advice to, you know, the Biden administration, the Quad, or the Euro Quad, or Boris Johnson, or any of the sort of Western decision makers who now all seem to be waking up more or less to the idea that China is some kind of threat and we need to do something different and more against it. If you could give some advice to Western decision makers on information operations, what would it be? Let's go to you first, Mate, and then I'll go to Sarah, and then Maria, and then to Cindy. Mate, what should we do?
Yeah, so of course there are several things that we can do depending on whether we want to improve the public understanding of the problem, or whether we want to prevent the spread of disinformation from a more legal perspective, and so forth. One thing that I'm quite interested in, and I think that could be quite important, is actually treating media as a strategic industry, a sort of a critical infrastructure, which is important in the age where information is increasingly more important and increasingly more used in kind of hybrid warfare. So here I think it would be prudent to actually treat media as a critical infrastructure for the purpose of the FBI screening mechanisms that are increasingly being built throughout the Western world. Of course, an important issue is the transparency of the media ownership as such. So really, it would be very helpful to have a robust transparency measures in place to actually oblige media to publish who are the ultimate beneficial owners. We have similar measures already in place in Slovakia for the beneficiaries of public funding and public health insurance companies that have to always disclose and verify the final owners. And something similar could be done for the media as well, just for the sake to know that who are these media possibly controlled by. And the third issue that should not be overlooked is the regulation of advertisement, because we see that the Chinese tactics could possibly evolve in the future towards targeting advertisement companies more often than the media themselves, because there is a growing, I think, understanding that media is being treated as a sensitive sector in the West. But the problem here is that a lot of the revenues that media receive goes to advertisement agencies. And we've already seen in Czech Republic that the China Link subject has purchased a large stake in a large advertisement agency, which could be possibly abused in the future to control how the funding is distributed among media that are less critical or more critical towards China. So I think these are the three measures that could be quite important, and I'll leave it at this so that others can offer something more as well. But I want to have another side note maybe, and that's actually that we should also try to understand whether these information operations by China have the effect that they are trying to achieve. And we see that the public opinion is increasingly negative throughout the Western countries towards China. That the narratives on COVID-19 did not really help China to disassociate itself from the origin of the pandemic. So maybe we see that they are not really so effective, and that's also something that we should be mindful of, and it is a good sign to know that maybe we are more resilient towards Chinese operations than we maybe think.
Well, I certainly agree with your last point that I feel if the Chinese ambassador to Stockholm didn't exist, we'd be wanting to invent him, because he's done so much to alert Swedish public opinion to the shape of the threat with his extraordinarily abrasive and unpleasant remarks and about shotguns for our enemies and fine wine for our friends. It's just a kind of a perfect illustration. But Sarah, do you want to jump in either from a US point of view or more globally, picking up either on what Matti said or making some suggestions of your own?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would second all of those ideas. I think this element of really looking at the advertising sector is really important, because certainly we've seen that as something that's been done quite a bit in the Chinese language space. And I think besides this question of kind of the messaging impact is this element of really the financial sustainability of independent media, whether you're talking about in the Chinese language sector or otherwise, and being able to identify ways to not have that vulnerability be a contributor to changing content and narratives, and restrictions on editorial independence is really important. I would add, I think, just in general, in terms of this question of overall just mainstreaming and kind of keeping an eye on this for any engagement related to media development funding, media literacy programs. This is maybe more in terms of kind of government donor activities and engagement with civil society. But I mean, like in Taiwan, obviously there it's really urgent, but it's a little bit more evident. But there's been a lot of effort in terms of incorporating elements related to Chinese disinformation or influence operations into broader media literacy programs. And so I think that's one of the things to consider for people to know what Xinhua News is. And not just know that it's a Chinese state media, but like really how tightly editorially controlled a lot of the content is. So I mean, I think there's elements of that. The other thing I think is there's actually a lot to be said for just enforcing existing laws. I mean, a lot of what we saw in terms of some of the recent decisions from Ofcom in the UK in terms of looking at CGTN's licensing, looking at some of the content being aired in terms of forced confessions and so forth. is really actually just enforcing existing laws in ways that it's really to the credit of civil society groups like Safeguard Defenders that have brought it to their attention. But I think some of the things related to the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the United States, there's actually in some cases some laws in the books that are supposed to be meant for these purposes and that aren't really being enforced as much as they could be for this purpose. And I think in other cases and in other countries, it may be a matter of trying to identify what laws could reasonably be passed in order to enhance transparency, protect issues of cross ownership in terms of a lot of countries will have laws about whether a content producer can actually also be in charge of content dissemination infrastructure. And I think you're seeing in various parts of the world, Chinese companies with close ties to the Chinese government getting more into that content dissemination over infrastructure element. And so making sure there are rules in place that limit their ability to use that gatekeeper power to amplify certain sources and marginalize other sources, because we're seeing that happen, is really important too. And the last thing I would say, which isn't so much in the media space, but I think is just this element of kind of the Chinese language space, whether you're talking about finding ways to support independent Chinese language media or independent Chinese language instruction. Like in terms of, there's a reason why not just Confucius Institutes at the college level, but Confucius Classrooms, which is a mother of a first grader who learns Chinese. It's K through 12 kids, and there's hundreds of them just in the United States. And again, I think there's just questions about really being able to allow people and children who want to learn Chinese to be able to do it kind of independent of funding, from the Chinese government, because honestly, in today's day and age, like it isn't the strategic interest of the United States to have people who can speak Chinese. It's not even just, as well as the demand from the family side. But I think trying to find ways to support that and enhance the independence from Chinese government funding would be important.
Yeah, and the thing that jumps out from that is that how much of this works because we let it. Nobody put a gun to our heads and said, stop teaching Chinese so that Confucius classrooms look really attractive and are the only opportunity. We did that. We cut back on our foreign language training, or never had it in the first place, and nobody put a gun to our head and said don't enforce your own laws. We just chose not to do it. Maria, what would be your take? I'm interested in particularly any thoughts you have on stuff we've learned from dealing with Russian disinformation that we might be able to apply to dealing with Chinese disinformation.
Yeah, I guess as an academic in this group and someone who's been studying Chinese persuasion for some time, I'm a little bit reluctant to kind of frame all of this as sharp power and to kind of treat everything that China does, including Confucius Institutes, as really just a form of propaganda. Because empirically, first of all, we know very little about, is it propaganda or is it mostly teaching Chinese language? I mean, those things are not necessarily always so dark, right? So the existing studies, one book in particular that's recently came out, looking at CIs in the US, finds that in fact, Chinese teachers stay away from discussing most political topics, and students still are suspicious of the Chinese Communist Party. So they come out of it learning Chinese, but they're not by any means sort of brainwashed. They're actually very critical, and the experiences they have in China as part of the camps or other tours leave them also more critical of China than before. So it's many ways it kind of, I guess, echoes the other sentiments here that some of these efforts, they're not necessarily working, or they're not as scary as maybe we sort of come out to think of them initially. So I think part of it is also educating ourselves, educating the policymakers that yes, some of it may need significant, new restraints. Or I really like the comments before about the advertising kind of industry and being preemptive about laws, right, and using our laws. But at the same time, we also have to be aware that some of these things are just kind of, they play out on their own, right? Teaching Chinese language may not necessarily, and for the most part, does not yield this kind of propagandistic response either in Europe or in the US, by the way. And in many African countries that I've been looking at, they're mostly about job provisions. They're providing jobs as translators. So again, not necessarily kind of a brainwashing operation, but more so an employment opportunity that is actually very beneficial to people with a very high unemployment rate in the country. So I think that that's something that to me is very important, including journalism. And some of this is coercive and some of it is an attempt to tell sort of a constructive story. So we have to understand that a lot of these journalists are not propagandists per se. They're actually very educated, open-minded people. I've interviewed many of them, and they're not trying to brainwash someone, but they're under significant restrictions from their bosses, and they're trying to be journalists. So some of them actually are attempting to tell a better story. So I'm sensitive to kind of complicating this a little bit, not to kind of treat it all as this black hole of, I think, sharp power. But in addition to that, I think what's really useful as part of kind of China's outreach to the global South is empowering more journalists from developing countries to come here, to come to Europe, to study, to train, and those kind of media fellowships and trainings, I think, are really, really highly desired. From my interviews, I found that everybody wants to do it, but they have no idea how to get in and how to do them because they're really inaccessible, they're extremely competitive. Whereas Chinese trainings are pretty open, it's very easy to get there. So they end up going to China.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, it's not necessarily, again, that they're influenced by it, but they do really desire to come to Europe or the US first. And those are not very expensive. So I think doing that would be really, really effective. So thank you.
Yes, I'm sure that's right. And it picks up on what Mate was saying about how we need to treat the information system as if it's a strategic issue. We tend to be much more focused on Chinese hardware and software vulnerabilities when it comes to tech, and that's very good, but the information system's important too. Cindy, do you want to, you are sitting in London, which is at the cusp at the moment, I think, of an inflection in Britain's China policy with the new strategic integrated review coming out. So do you want to wrap us up, and both on countermeasures or picking up on anything else that the other panelists have said?
Yeah, so the integrated review has been looked forward to for a while now, and the integration there refers to coinciding Britain's economic, security, defence interest all into one strategy. And it's been a bit controversial here in London. Some Tory backbench MPs, as well as some Labour MPs, have accused it of not being tough enough on China. But actually, a piece that I'm working on at the moment is just to compare it to the Biden administration's approach. And actually, you know what? Both say that China should be seen as a strategic competitor. China should be seen as a challenge, not as necessarily an ally, but that Russia is the one that creates this sort of national security threat, because that is the one, poisoning people within country territories. So that approach, actually, I don't think is so different to what the Biden administration is doing, which is just to see that China's not going anywhere. It's not quite the USSR. It's not so easily cut off. And also that the system is much more robust in a lot of ways than the USSR's was. So given that starting point, where do you go with this growing superpower? And I think that actually the integrated review gives quite a mature answer to that. Going back to your original question of what we should do more, I think I agree a lot with what's already been said about Chinese language education. Parallel conversations go both ways, right? I think a lot of people in the West don't think about what things are being said in China, or how, not even just the government, how the Chinese public, not necessarily brainwashed, but just how the Chinese public sees certain issues. And that parallel thinking, I think, we need to bridge that gap as well. And so, CGTN's ban by Ofcom has been mentioned. I'm in a bit of two minds about that. Obviously, they did infringe Ofcom rulings, and being at The Spectator, we know all about that. But is it really the best to take something like that off air so that we can't see what is being said on Chinese media in an accessible way? I'm not entirely sure. So as much as I'm bemused by the wolf warriors and concerned by them, it's at least good to see what the Chinese narrative is, especially for people who don't speak Chinese. And then on the point of independent Chinese media sources, Twitter, as of last year, started identifying government-related sources by having a disclaimer underneath them. But I think there needs to be a better understanding of the different types of Chinese media. So there's Xinhua, obviously, on one side, People's Daily, all that, Global Times, all that sort of stuff. But then on the other side, there are much more independent, not completely independent, but more independent sources, civil society sources, like, for example, Caixin, Sixth Tone, who have, much more independent analysis, and it's not quite right, as Twitter has done, to identify them as government mouthpieces. And so having that nuance in our approach to Chinese media, I think, will be really important as well.
Well, that's a great note to end on, the need for nuance, but also for clarity of vision and purpose. So I want to thank you all very much indeed for contributing to this SIPA discussion on Chinese information operations. I've enjoyed that. Was Cindy Yu, who is the host of the Chinese Whispers podcast and works at The Spectator. We also have been joined by Maciej Szymalczyk from the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, Maria Repnikova from the Woodrow Wilson Center, also Georgia State University, author of 2 forthcoming books, which we can't wait to read, and Sarah Cook research director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House, edits the China Media Bulletin, and also working on a big study on Chinese soft power, which we also can't wait to read. I'm Edward Lucas. Thank you from everyone at SIPA, and please stay tuned for other China-related events in the days and weeks ahead. Goodbye.